This man wanted to kill me. He thought I'd murdered his son, but the whole thing was a misunderstanding.
I didn't kill your son.
Fuck you.
Cops are up to something. Why do they want you dead?
How should I know?
They use my family as bait. I want to know why.
To convince him, we went to his son's grave together. When we dug up the coffin, the body inside wasn't Freddy. On top of that, the corpse's fingerprints had been destroyed. Someone had deliberately tried to hide the dead man's identity. Once we realized the truth had been manipulated, Ben and I went to a cafe to figure out our next move. He told me his name was Ben Russell, a retired soldier. To get to the bottom of this, he called up an old war buddy who now worked as a private investigator. The next day, the sheriff came by on his own to see me. He wanted to explain why Freddy looked different. I didn't trust him anymore, but I played along and accepted the explanation. Half an hour later, Jim showed up. The three of us sat down together. Jim had already dug up the real story on Freddy. He'd been a gang member, but he'd cut a deal with the FBI in Houston and become an informant, so the Bureau put him in witness protection. My act of self-defense that night gave Freddy the perfect chance to fake his death and disappear. Now everyone, including the gang, believed he was dead. No one would come looking for him. But the question remained, where exactly in Houston was Freddy hiding? And who was the man I actually killed that night? To find the truth and to put my family and myself at ease, I decided to go to Houston with them. We got to Houston and stayed at Jim's ranch. Jim had already gotten a list from one of his contacts, a handful of young men living in Houston with no known relatives. We zeroed in on a young guy with blonde hair and blue eyes. The easiest way to confirm his identity was to have Ben call him, but Ben hadn't seen his son in years. He refused to do it over the phone. He needed to see him with his own eyes. We drove to the guy's place. The second we pulled up, a car came tearing out of the driveway and slammed into us. Jim was furious. He got out, ready to tear into the kid.
You want some of this?
He walked up to the front door and knocked, but no one answered. The kid clearly wasn't Ben's son either. On the way out, Jim kicked the car and popped the trunk. Inside were a few homemade videotapes. Back at the ranch, Jim played the tapes. There was Freddy, right on screen. What Freddy was doing in those videos was beyond evil. He was killing people for fun, filming it all with that kid like it was entertainment. Ben didn't know yet. He was upstairs, calling the number from the house we'd just visited. When he heard the voice on the other end, he knew that was his son. By the time he came downstairs, Jim and I couldn't bring ourselves to tell him what was on those tapes.
What's on the tape?
Do yourself a favor, Holmes.
What's on the tape?
Jim loaded a tape into the player, and we walked out of the room. A few minutes later, we heard Ben smash the tape to pieces. After seeing what his son had done, he walked to the car with a gun in his hand. He couldn't live with what he'd just seen. I stopped him, and he calmed down for the moment. We couldn't turn the tapes over to the cops because Freddy was under FBI protection, and every woman he'd killed was an undocumented immigrant. Nobody was going to care. The next morning, I was jolted awake by gunshots. Ben had made up his mind he was going to deal with his son himself. Rather than let that monster keep killing, he'd send him to hell with his own hands. Ben